Roger asked me to talk about ethics, so I said, well, how about Confucian ethics? Which, although I obviously do a lot of stuff on ethics in general, Confucian ethics is more my specialty. So, and it's interesting and fun, so why not a talk on this? Just make sure my pointer works. Okay, good. There he is. That's not really him. I mean, obviously no pictures. So Confucius, or Kongsa in Chinese, he was a 5th century thinker. In philosophy, we like to talk about him as a philosopher, but he's not really a philosopher. It's a little weird to call him that. He doesn't argue with anyone. He walks around with the book, The Analects, he walks around with his students and they talk about ethical issues, but they don't theorize at all. It's not Platonic, it's not that sort of structure. So it's a little weird to call him a philosopher. He's more of just an ethicist, a practicing ethicist, walking around trying to help people to be good. And that's probably more the better way to describe him. His major work was the Analects. I brought a bunch of copies just to pass them around. There's a bunch of, I've got every translation, but I just brought a few. So I want to just take a peek. And this is actually something I bought when I was teaching in China. I actually taught Confucius in China. It was a very, very interesting experience teaching Confucianism to Chinese in English. But I bought this when I was there. It was very, very funny. It's like a children's book for the Analects. It's illustrated. It's kind of a funny thing. And, okay, so, let's see, can I still get to? Good, okay. So the best way to talk about Confucianism is to sort of try to situate the discussion inside ethics in general. In the West, we tend to think of ethics as falling under 3 big theories, one or the other. Deontology, consequentialism, and virtue ethics. And then when we're looking at Eastern thinkers, I tend to do this. There are certain people inside Eastern studies who would get very upset about this. I try to see, do these Eastern thinkers sort of seem to have things in common with some of these Western frameworks? Some people are very opposed by that. They don't want to do that sort of enterprise. But it helps. It definitely helps students to think this way. It helps me to think this way. So what I'll do is just present the 3 main ethical theories and then say Confucius is more similar to one than the other ones, and it'll just kind of help. So the first is deontology. Deontologists tend to think that ethics is about the following of rules or principles or laws that the person sees as properly generated by the right lawgiver, whoever that turns out to be. So there are versions of deontology that are very religious, where you would say, here are the principles. Why are those principles? Why do they have a kind of demand on me? Because I see that the lawgiver, God, is the one who created the principles, and that's sort of the source of my obligations. Other deontologists like Kant think, well, it's not really God, it's rather pure reason. There's some sort of ability we have to sort of ascend self-interested thinking and think on a purely reason-based sort of a framework. And that's deserving of my ultimate respect. So the principles that come out of that are obligating for me. A consequentialist is much more concerned with outcomes. So for the consequentialist, they're just looking at the world and saying, is there a lot of X or not a lot of X? We want to increase X. X is a good thing. X sometimes turns out to be things like pleasure, if you're a hedonistic version of that, or it could just be well-being or utility, maximum societal well-being, that sort of stuff. So they're not as interested in principles, they're more interested in just how do we maximize certain sorts of states in the world. Does that make sense? The deontologist is not really all that concerned with states. They're more concerned with principles. Follow those principles even if states turn out not so good, right? So they're kind of in opposition. And then the virtue ethicists, very different from both, these folks care about excellence. It's not a case, a discussion about actions, as it seems to be for the deontologist, certain principles that you're following. It's not a focusing on outcomes. It's rather a focus of who you are. Are you an excellent person? Do you exemplify whatever excellence turns out to be? Right? And that's a further question. What is excellence? But it's a different way of understanding what the ethical sort of program is. So, just a quick folks in deontology, Kant, perhaps Hinduism in the East, or that's how I teach it in my courses. Consequentialists, you get people like John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham, and then in the East, you would get perhaps Buddhism, folks like Moza, who comes right after Confucius. And then the virtue ethics tradition, definitely Aristotle and Plato, and I would argue Confucius. So what I'm going to try to do is kind of try to understand virtue ethics a little bit, and then try to situate Confucius in that big tradition. So does virtue ethics make sense generally? You're trying to not follow laws, that's not the primary focus, not trying to maximize outcomes, but rather trying to cultivate certain sorts of states of excellence inside of the person. So here's the general frame. Exemplify excellence. So the question becomes, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to be excellent? In all virtue ethic traditions, excellence essentially comes out to mean actualize what you potentially are. I mean, that's another kind of motto, but you look at the type of thing that you are, you have to figure what that is, and then virtue ethicists tend to think that sort of in there is kind of the potential for you to become something that you're not really right now, right? You're just potentially that thing. So excellence is sort of the path that you take to closer and closer getting to that actualized kind of type that you are. So this is what I use in class when I try to explain, students love diagrams, right? They have to be given diagrams so they can sort of map on in their head what a theory is doing. And I give them diagrams for all of these theories. Virtue ethics works like this. My wife hates this diagram because the arrows, she says, go in the wrong direction. Why do an arrow go that way? She says all arrows must go from left to right. But in the theory, actually, that means something. If an arrow goes from the left to the right, it means the thing on the left, the job of that thing is to maximize the thing on the right. So remember consequentialism. What's their goal? Maximize good outcomes. So if you were to ask, what's the right action? That's R. Well, in that diagram for consequentialism, it would be R, left to right, the good, which is pleasure or well-being or something. That's your goal, maximize good outcomes. From right to left means exemplify. Think of a friendship to try to understand the difference. If you're trying to exemplify a friendship, is that different from maximizing a friendship? Does that make sense? Like if I said, you're in a friendship, what are you trying to do? If somebody said, well, maximize the friendship, you would say, well, I don't really know what you mean. How does that work? How do you maximize a friendship? But you can exemplify a friendship. It means to stand as a proper exemplar of what the friendship represents. Does that make sense? So whenever you see an arrow going from the right to the left, it means the job of the thing on the right is to exemplify the thing on the left. So if you were to ask, what's the right action for me to do in a virtue ethic? Exemplify A meaning the exemplary agent. In virtue ethics, there's always some exemplary agent floating around that you're supposed to pattern. So I always think, like in Christianity, if you say, well, what should I do? What would Jesus do? This is kind of the perfect example of R to A, right? I understand my actions and whether they're appropriate or not in the context of some other agent who's seen as much more excellent than me. Does that make sense? And then you want to know, well, who's the exemplary agent, right? Because that's just some person. Well, that person is the person who exemplifies S, which is all the right states. In virtue ethics, those are the virtues. So in some agents exemplify the vices. Avoid those folks. Don't exemplify those folks. Find the people who exemplify virtues. Those are the folks who turn out to be the exemplars. The next question is, well, how do you know what the right states are? Right? you get this kind of thing, well, what's that? What's that? Well, what are the right states? They're the ones that allow the agent to exemplify the good. And the good is the type of thing that you are. Coming back to this question before, that virtue ethics is saying exemplify excellence. Does that make sense? I mean, it's a little more complication. What I want to do today is just look at the S and G part and put it in Confucius. So all I care about today, because it's a pretty complicated theory, all I care about today is in Confucianism, what does it mean to be the type of thing you are? That's G, right? That's the excellent entity. And what sort of virtues do you need to have to exemplify the type of thing you are? Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, so these are the questions we'd have to ask. In Confucianism, what is the good? What's the type of thing you are? And then how do we get there, right? What types of states of character do I need to exemplify G and to be excellent as a human being? Okay, so let's start with G. This is, I had to expand out the character a little bit, so it's a little distorted. But in Chinese, G in Confucius is Ren. That's the word in Chinese. That's R-E-N. And Ren means, that's that character on the right, that big character that's a little blurry. That's what you're trying to exemplify. That's what human beings are. That's your type. Well, what is this? One of the cool things about Chinese sometimes is that the characters break down into pieces, so you can look at the pieces sometimes and figure out what the larger piece means by looking at what the smaller components mean. In Ren, that large character has two parts. The part on the left means person, the part on the right means two. So if you were to put them together, what would that mean, do you think? I mean, it's a very cool kind of notion here. To be human, which is Ren, is person plus two. What do you think? It's a kind of peculiar way to understand the word human, right? I mean, when you say, well, what's a human being? People typically think, well, they think in terms of the biological species human, right? Well, humans are different from animals. Humans have 2 arms and 2 legs, or whatever. They give a biological description. What Confucius is saying, there's something different to being human. It requires two-ness. That's it. If there aren't two people in a relationship, you don't have any human beings. This is Confucius's central point. Essentially, you cannot be the thing that you are by yourself. It's not possible. Does that make sense? It's a very interesting notion of understanding what we are as individual things. Basically, that we're not really individual things. We exist as humans only within relationships. And relationships have, as their most basic, two people, right? It's a kind of cool notion. So what we're trying to do when we become excellent is move away from one and towards, at the very least, two, because that's what we are. Yeah, Roger.
Reading Confucius, it seems to me that he's primarily concerned with developing the character of the individual in order to create a good society.
Yeah, yeah. On a larger scale, right. But it has to start with the relationship of two. When you see that relationship, then you see the relationship between a smaller relationship and a bigger one. Like, let's say the family is a very fundamental unit for Confucius. Once you understand how the family works, in this sense, then you have the model to understand how a community will work. And then you have an understanding for how a government should work, or a society should work. Does that make sense? It's always understood in the same way. Never thinking in terms of isolation, and always thinking of the completedness of a unit as requiring something outside of itself, a relationship. So does this make sense so far? It's kind of a cool notion. Okay, so I'm going to go through this kind of, I don't want to waste too much time. I had some stuff in there. It was kind of cool, but I don't want to burn up too much time on it. So instead, I wanted to just compare quickly. This is a weird way of understanding the self that we're not used to, right, frankly. So let's compare it quickly to Western understandings and ancient Eastern understandings. In the West, we tend to think of what we are, you know, ourselves, as kind of independent. I'm here, you're over there, there's a bunch of different individuals in the room. And actually, if you asked people, write on a piece of paper to describe yourself, and you did it in the West, you'll tend to get a type of pattern that will emerge. People will say things like, I'm smart, they'll list traits that they consider to be internal to themselves, or they'll list their physical attributes, things like that. If you ask the same sorts of questions to Easterners, they will answer very differently. They'll say things like, I'm a brother. I am the son of so-and-so. I'm a hardworking student. Those sorts of things. These are relational sorts of descriptions, which leads you to the kind of Confucian intuition that in that culture, understanding who you are is linked up intrinsically with some other larger framework. Whereas in the West, it's more, well, what kind of character, not characters, but like, what's inside here, separate from outside of there. So this is the typical Western view, and this is kind of the Eastern view, sort of like this, right? Where one thing, here's me, and here's my mom, we're overlapped in a way, right? And the way I understand myself when I'm with my mother is through that dyadic connection in a way, right? I understand myself as a son. Does that make sense? I'm not thinking of myself as a teacher when I'm with my mom, but when I'm in class I do. I think of myself as a teacher with a bunch of students, right? When I'm at home, I think of myself as a dad with my daughters, or a husband with my wife. For the Confucian, if you take away all of those overlaps, there's nothing left. That's his general position. Whereas in the West, we tend to think, well, first there's me, and then I add to me a bunch of relationships that I choose to enter into. Right? For Confucius, it's not the case. What you are the sum of all those overlapping relationships, and there's nothing left after taking those things away. So if you understand this notion of exemplifying excellence in Confucius, what does it look like it probably will start to sound like? In each of those situations, what do you think my aim is going to be? When I'm with my mom, when I'm with my students, when I'm with my daughters, what do you think my aim will be? Yeah, to be the absolute best son I can be, to be the absolute best teacher I can be, because that's what I am. And excellence as the type that I am requires that I pay attention to who I am right now and to develop the virtues or the character states required for me to interact with that person the right way. Does that make sense? Okay, this gets a little more complicated. Now we'll get into Confucianism, and now we get a little more detail. So for Confucius, how does this work? Well, here's just one of those dyads, right? Dyad, I just mean a unit of two connected. So here's one of them. Notice there's the overlapping component, right? And then there's the part that's not. So you've got this part and then that part. In the overlap, what is that for Confucius? If you think, here's that part where me and my mom overlap, son and mom. What is that part? For Confucius, that's our shared identity. We both understand ourselves in a common way. We're family members, right? We have a common aim. Families have a direction. There's also a language that governs that relationship. Confucius says it's the language of what he calls Li. Li is ritual. There's a certain sort of way of behaving that's sort of specific to sons and mothers and daughters and fathers and so on, right? Does that make sense? It's almost like if I want to be a good son, I have to learn the language of sonhood. If I want to be a good teacher, I have to learn the language of teacherhood. And it's a behavioral language, right? It's not a spoken language. It's a way of acting. It's a way of behaving. I mean, there's certain types of behaviors that would be appropriate in front of my mom that would not be appropriate in a different situation, different language. On the other side, you've got my feelings, in a way, like my particular feelings and my particular identity and like my differences, right? I'm not any son, I'm a particular son. And I also have emotions and such. So the goal here for Confucius is to bring the two together. Bring together my shared language that I have with others with my feelings and my particularity. Can I bring them together into a harmony in a way? Let me talk more about how that's going to work. So Confucius says in the Analects about the middle part, he says, to learn and not reflect leads to perplexity, he says. And to not learn, I messed up. To learn and not reflect leads to perplexity. To reflect and not learn leads to perilous behavior. Just think of the first side, to learn. It's very important in Confucius that you're always learning. He's the perfect teacher, always going out and studying and studying. What are you studying? Remember, he's an ethicist. He's not saying go study physics. Study what? Relationships. And what can you learn about relationships? The language. Where do you learn that language? You don't make it up. Where does it come from? He's always telling his students are saying, Master, how do I be Ren? How does it work? And he'll say, is the Book of Li missing? It's like an ancient cultural book. The Book of Rites, where is it? Where are the histories? Basically saying, go back and understand the tradition, right? Where does the language of being a son come from? A 2,000-year history of discussion about what that means to be a son. Pay attention to it, right? To reflect is to sort of bring the emotion to the situation. So you learn and you bring your emotion and combine them. So here's the typical Confucian student, exhausted from many, many years of constant learning, right? Constantly reading these books and trying to understand what does it mean to be Ren, right? Confucius will always, his students will say, what am I supposed to do? And this is a very Western type question. What am I supposed to do? Just tell me what I'm supposed to do. And Confucius says, forget what you're supposed to do. Go understand who you are. Once you understand who you are, those things kind of flow right from it, right? And that's a very virtue ethical way of thinking. So here's the exhausted guy. So how do you do this? Well, this is what I was just saying. You master the Li. That's the first part. Master an understanding of what it means to be the type of thing you are in this situation. Mother, teacher, daughter, son, pastor, parishioner, whatever the case may be. Here's a quote, it's a long quote, I'll just read it through. Yan Hui asked the master about Ren, right? They're always at, what is Ren? Just tell, what's the answer? Typical students, right? Just give me the answer. What is Ren? And the master said, to subdue yourself and return to ritual. This is Ren. If a man can for one day subdue himself and return to ritual, all under heaven will ascribe Ren to him. And Yan Hui said, I beg you to ask the steps of the process. And the master says, don't look at what's contrary to ritual. Don't listen to what's contrary to ritual. Don't speak about what's contrary to ritual. Don't have any movements that are contrary to ritual. And Yan Hui says, well, although I'm pretty stupid, I'll give it my best shot, right? That's essentially his answer. Very typical Yan Hui answer. Yan Hui is his favorite student. Very, very smart, but extremely humble, right? He's always talking about how dumb he is, right? So it's a very, very typical answer. But he's saying, look, this is an essential component. Go learn who you are, right? There's something you already are, you just have to figure out how to actualize it. Okay, so what's the first virtue? Remember we were talking about what are the virtues? Remember, you have to cultivate virtues to become excellent. So what's the primary virtue already? It's called zhang. What does that mean? Loyalty and commitment to what? To the relationship and to understanding what it is. Being committed to the language of the relationship. It's almost as if the language is the common ground, the common project that holds the relationship together. And you're both committed to understanding what it is, figuring it out, and sort of learning the fluency of that language, right? That's the common ground floor. Okay, but that's not enough, right? And I love this quote in book 2. So Zulu, who's a very interesting character, Zulu asks Confucius what filial piety is, and this is just sort of like reverence for your parents, right? So what's filial piety? And the master says, filial piety nowadays means feeding and caring for one's parents. But one also feeds and cares for one's dogs and horses. So without reverence, what's there to distinguish the one support from the other? So what's Confucius's claim here? Because Zulu could say, I'm Zhang, right? isn't he? I care for my parents. I know the Li. The Li is to pay for them, to cover their health care bills, to make sure that they have food in their refrigerator, right? To be respectful when I see them. Don't grab the last chicken leg off the table, whatever the Li may be. I do all that stuff. But Confucius says, what? It's not enough. Why not? It's external, right? The Li on some level can be outside of you. Almost like you're saying, what am I supposed to do again? That sort of thing. And then you do it because you want to match up with the proper rituals, right? So he's saying you have to bring something to the rituals, which are your feelings. This is what we were talking about before. Harmonizing feeling with fluency of the language. So that's the other part, adding particularity, reflecting. Think of a romantic relationship. This is my favorite example. My students love this example in class. So I say, imagine you're dating somebody for a year and you have your 1-year anniversary, right? So you go out to wherever and you're sitting down and it's got candles, got the dinner shows up, right? And one says to the other, tears flowing, and says, I'm so happy that we've made it a year. You're so loyal, you're so committed, et cetera, et cetera. And then the other person says, yeah, this is all true, but let me say something first. I am loyal. I am John, right? However, I'm always constantly thinking about cheating on you, right? Always, like constantly. I just can't get it out of my mind, right? When the waiter or waitress, whatever the case may be, that's all I was thinking about. I was trying to pay attention to you, looking up. But fear not, I have an iron will, right? And I'll never act on any of that stuff because I'm really John, right? So eat up. All right. What do you think happens at this point? right. What? But why? I mean, can't the person say, I'm loyal? Isn't that loyalty? I'm John. Mm-hmm. It's not really you, right? You're just there's a you that's trying to kind of make sure it acts in accord with a bunch of stuff that's external to you. And this is Confucius's whole thing. Remember, become the thing that you are. If you are a husband or a wife or a boyfriend or a teacher, it has to be you, not something you're acting in accord with. It has to be you. The Li have to become internal to you such that your emotions are infused by them in such a way that you actually see the world in terms of the Li. So change the situation, back it up. New conversation. I'm so happy that you're here, blah, 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 you're loyal. And then the person says, oh, me too, right? The waiter or waitress is coming, and all you see is the server now. You know what I mean? Your vision has changed. And it's changed because your emotions are different. Your focus is different, right? Everything that you are on the inside is harmonized with the Li's intention, right? You actually experience things through the language of your relationship. That is being a husband or a wife or a boyfriend or a teacher or whatever the case may be. But that takes a whole lot of training, right, to learn how to do that right. And that's kind of the job of somebody walking this path. So basically what Confucius is saying is what you want to aim for here is what I call like a human inness. Like, think of this boyfriend, let's just say, who says, I'm in this relationship. I show up, right? And the other person's basically saying, you're kind of spatially in, you're present in a way, but you're not really here. You're checked out. You know that language, right? All of you is not here. Remember, you're a human being for Confucius. Every component of what you are has to be present and not checked out. Part of you is a behavioral thing. Part of you is an emotional thing. Part of you is a cognitive thing. All of it has to be present and focused in the right direction. That's when, as a human being, you come together and you become excellent. Otherwise, you're divided against yourself, he would say. You're not excellent. Does that make sense?
Is that congruence? When we talk about congruence?
Yeah, sure.
Your behavior and your
absolutely, yeah.
belief is the same.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. You don't want it to become a matter of willpower, in a way, right? Because the more they come apart, the more it's like my will has to step in, right? It's like I know what I'm supposed to do cognitively. My feelings are not totally aligned, they're incongruent, and then my will comes in and forces, adherence to the rules. That's something Confucius would say, hey, that's better than doing the wrong thing completely, but that's not quite virtue either. Does that make sense? That might be like a stepping stone to get to virtue, but you're not quite at virtue. Okay, so let's look at one last thing, which is very important, because that's the emotional and behavioral congruence, but there's one more component. So we talked about this one. Not reflecting means lacking emotional focus. I'm not in the relationship emotionally. But it also means lacking particularity as an entity. Remember, if I'm in a relationship with my mom, I'm not any son, I'm this son. There has to be something about this that's here, because that's part of my humanity too. That can't check out. So it can't just be a matter of total conformity, because then the this drops out. Does that make sense? So how do we get that in? Well, you've got to look at this. Most Confucian relationships are hierarchical. This bugs people on some level. I'll talk about that in a minute. But they are. That's just the way he sees them. So think of like teacher-student, parent-child, and so on. I think he even thinks friendships are hierarchical. It's just that over time they're this way, but they do this a lot, right? And then over the span of a long time, they turn out to be like this. But in any particular instance, one person usually is acting as a kind of teacher or a mentor to the other, right? And this is kind of, so you just think of it in time. So how's this going to work? Okay. The master said, Shen, my doctrine is that of an all-pervading unity. And Zhuangzi, who was one of the disciples, said, that's true. The master left, and the other disciple said, what was he talking about? And Zhuangzi says, the doctrine of the master is loyalty to principle, which is Zhang, right? And being benevolent in the exercise of them towards others, that's called Shu. Shu is an incredibly important component of Confucius, and you don't see it until you talk about hierarchy. So, and that's that particularity element. So remember, Zhang, now think of it this way, right? Instead of like on an equal plane, it's hierarchical. Each person has to be Zhang towards the other by being what? Committed to that Li fluency, remember, the language of the relationship? But the person on the top has an extra job because the person on the top is in power. The person on the bottom is not. So think of people who use rituals and beat people with them. You know what I'm talking about? And for selfish reasons. I usually think of an example with my mom. My mom lives out in Boston. Let's say my mom gets sick. And the Li would prescribe that a good son visits their mother if their mother is sick in the hospital, right? But I live in Missouri, I can't get there, let's say. Or I went there once, but I can't get there the next weekend, whatever the case may be. Well, how does my mother respond? She's in a position of power, right? She has the ritual prepared to beat me with, right? And she can. Sometimes she has, right? But let's say she's talking to me on the phone, and I say, Ma, I'm trying to get there. I've tried, I've sent you flowers. I call you every night, that sort of thing. In a way, what I'm showing is that my feeling is striving and looking for a ritual. You see what I mean? To grasp onto, to make virtue possible in this relationship. My mother could say, I don't really care. Boom, boom, boom. Good sons show up every other day and they visit their mothers, right? If that's the case, my mother is not committed to the excellence of our relationship. You see that? She's committed to some sort of selfish desire that she has, right? To sort of dominate me or, get back at me for something she's mad at me about from years ago, whatever the case may be. So in that case, she really should be Shu. And Shu means she opens the rituals up in a way by flexibility and makes it possible for my behavior to become a ritual that's virtuous. Do you see that? My going once a month and buying flowers now becomes the ritual through which I can unite my feelings with virtue and be excellent. So now she's looking out for me and the relationship. But what if I call her up and I say, Ma, I was going to come out there, but I need to buy this 50-inch TV, and I can't do both at the same time, so I'm not coming. Now what? Now what should she do? Beat me with the rituals, right? Because I'm not Zhang. Do you see that? You have to be Zhang. In the other case, I am Zhang. I'm just searching, like, what do I do? You see what I mean? I'm committed, but I don't have the path through which to become virtuous. In the second case, I'm not Zhang, so there's no reason for her to be Shu. Now she should hit me with the rituals and say, you're a bad son. Bad sons are supposed to do X, Y, and Z. Do you see that? Different role. So somebody in power has to be very attentive to the differences about who they're dealing with. their situations, who they are as particular individuals, and always try to make a space for that difference to play a role in the relationship. Because relationships are different, right? No marriage is the same. No parenting relationship is the same, right? No community relationship is identical to another one, right? So it has to be particular. So here I say, when in power, be benevolent. Modify ritual with flexibility to help the other person become excellent. Great teachers create great students, great parents create great children, and so on. It's the use of power in a benevolent way that makes that possible. So Zhang says, same guy from before, is there one word which can serve as a rule of practice for all of one's life? And the master says, isn't shu such a word? What you do not want done to yourself, don't do to others, right? This is the Confucian golden rule. This is where it takes place inside of Confucianism. It's the prerogative of those in power, right? When you say that, it's usually what you're saying is, I could do this to you because I have power, right? But I ask myself, what do I want? I want excellence just as much as you do. So I use that rule of shu, which is the golden rule, to sort of pull in my behavior and understand what I should do. This is so just a kind of way of understanding how the relationships are. It's me and my daughter, right? So for me, I know I look very angry in that picture. So that's a typical happy shot for me. You know? No, so I just finished baking some cookies. So for me, in relation to my daughter Paige, I have to be Zhang and Shu. That's my role. It's a harder role because I'm in power. And for her, just Zhang, right? Another great quote, just to run through a couple of quotes, and then we'll wrap up. The master said, and this plays off what we were just talking about, the man of Ren, this is, it's anybody, it's not just men. The man of Ren, wishing to be established himself, and this is to become excellent, right, to actualize what I am, seeks all to establish others. That's Shu and Zhang. I'm acting in another way to help another person to become excellent. He seeks to enlarge others, to be able to judge of others by what is near to ourselves. That can be called Ren, right? And Ren and Zhang Shu coming together, just some cool quotes. The master said, be devoted to principle, which is just ritual, right? Zhang, but not inflexible, Shu, in small matters. So, yeah, of course, there's a common language that governs this relationship, but in small matters where you can make the flexibility possible to allow for excellence, you do so. Don't be overly committed to Zhang, right? That's empty. And the master is not for or against anything. This is one of the cool parts of Confucius that students have a hard time with. They'll want to know, is this action wrong or not? Right? It's a very, very typical way that people think about ethics. Confucius would say, I'm not for or against anything. There is no action that outside of a particular situation I can tell you what to do. It's just not possible, right? I'm not for or against anything. I'm on the side of appropriateness. And how do we know what's appropriate? By understanding who we are, right? In the situation, understanding the motives of the people. Like in one case, my mother should get mad at me, and the other she should not. Is it okay for me not to fly in? Is it okay for me to fly in? That question has a different answer, depending on who we are, what the situation is, what my motives are, and so on. So it's a very particularized kind of ethic. And you can see this in the relationship component. I love this quote. It's one of my favorites. Exemplary people, and that's the A. Remember, act like the exemplary person, right? The person who's virtuous. Exemplary people seek harmony, not sameness. Small people seek the opposite. In the Analects, there's this constant dichotomy between what's called the junzi. The junzi is like the exemplary person, and the shaoren, the small people, the petty people. And the two types play out right in this quote. The exemplary folks are always looking for what in relationships? Well, harmony is not, think of like when you cook. I make sauce a lot. I'm Italian, so I make Italian sauces. What I add actually is probably like 10 different spices or your herbs and such, right? But I add them in such a way that I think when you eat the sauce, you're like, what did you use? I almost can detect this, I almost can detect that, where all the components are playing off one another. There's a great difference in the food coming together to create a kind of aesthetic harmony, right? A taste harmony. Sameness is you overwhelm the sauce with basil, or whatever the case may be, right? Think of somebody in a relationship who has power, right, and is petty. What will they seek to do? That's right. That's right. That's right. That's right. That's right. Well, I mean, think of if you're in a relationship, and when I say this to students, they always go, "Oh yeah, I know exactly what you mean." I say, have you ever been in a relationship where the person right now who has power or resources or whatever wants to make you something? You know what I mean? Not virtuous necessarily, but how they want you to be, right? That's sameness. That's petty. I don't really care about you as a particular entity in the relationship. You're more kind of a tool for me in a way. There's something I want, and I need to kind of fine-tune you so that you're a really good tool for whatever it is that I need. Does that make sense? That's pettiness. Inside of a harmonious, exemplary relationship, both entities open up the space for those differences, even when those differences might upset you, as long as they're not in contrast with virtue. And that's a difficult question to kind of figure out sometimes, right? Okay. And the last quote, the master said, "It is man who is capable of broadening the way, not the way that is capable of broadening man." This is a very interesting quote. If you think of what's going on, let's think of like husbands and wives, you know, or teachers and students over history. As this conversation continues, remember, it's being particularized by the people in the conversations, which means that the Li are sort of doing this in a way. You see, they're moving. They're not identical to the Li from pre-Qin China. That would be bizarre, right? So they're moving and evolving. As they're evolving, what you're getting is the Tao is changing. The Confucian way is changing. It is the people who are broadening the way, not the way that is broadening the people. Does that make sense? It's very interesting. It's like, as we have the virtuous conversation, we kind of like create the conversation for the next people who are going to try to figure out what the right thing to do is. And I just ended with some final thoughts. These always come up when I talk about this stuff. One, people always, Confucian relationships are hierarchical, this is bad, right? So that's the first thing. Hierarchical relationships are a bad thing. Two, the Confucian tradition is highly resistant to discussions of rights, and it definitely is. Rights, R-I-G-H-T, very in favor of R-I-T-E-S, but not in favor of rights in the way that we think about them. Confucian relationships, not practice, create the perfect environments for abuse, and they do, right? When they go wrong, they go horribly wrong, because you have a hierarchical structure in which the person on the bottom's job is to be John, loyal, right? Not critical in the sense of, I'm out of here, you know what I mean? You have to try to help that other person all the time. The person on the top can choose to take that power and abuse it. So what do? The discussion of rights, just quickly, let me just throw this out, why Confucius is anti-rights is a typical conversation that happens in virtue ethics. All virtue ethic traditions have this kind of tension between virtue and justice. What's the conflict? Essentially, as they see it, the more you create structures of justice, the more you detract from the context for virtue. Once things become people's properties, as opposed to the way in which people should respond to you virtuously, you get this weird tension situation set up. So I think what Confucius would say is, like, think of the law. If your dad does something wrong, should you turn your dad in? Well, that's the law. That's just, right? Or should you try to work within the family to try to help your dad? You see the kind of tension here? He thinks, well, the more you have law and the more you pay attention to those sorts of things, the more virtue becomes like uninteresting or not necessary or something. But this is a tension at the bottom of all virtue ethical theories that for thousands of years that people have been trying to figure out. But I think what Confucius would reply is this. It's a kind of give and take here. When you go for virtue, I think he would say, what you're saying is build frameworks that make maximal excellence possible. But it also comes with great risk. You see that? Because you have great power that can be abused. Or you can go for a pure justice framework, which is really oriented not towards maximal excellence, but maximal protection. You see what I mean? But if you go that way, then you wind up with a situation where excellence is not possible past a certain point. You see what I mean? So you either go for protection, you know, but lose on the positive end, or you go for the positive but with great risks. Right? And I think, you know, the conversation is how do you balance that, or should you balance it? And that's a great question, but I think virtue ethics throws out that kind of that worry. So well, that's the whole thing. But it's a lot in there. Thank you. Are there any questions I can, yeah, go ahead.
I want you to talk a little bit more about ritual,
Yep.
rites, from whence are they derived, and what gives them their power.
I think for Confucius, they come out of historical tradition, essentially. So to be human, I think Confucius would say, is, remember we were talking about there's no me, there's me in a relationship. Then what about the relationship? There's no relationship. The relationship is situated in a larger context, let's say, of the community or the family. There's no family. There's a family in a society. Okay, now take everybody born right now. What about them? Are they good enough to determine what the right and the wrong? No. There's a tradition. He is definitely inherently, on the question of Li, a traditionalist. He thinks current society has no meaning until it's put in a relationship with what came before it. All the other human beings who have had this conversation. It's essentially a very long conversation that when people talk about it in the right way, that's when the Li has its proper kind of shape. Does that make sense?
That's a pretty optimistic view.
Oh yeah, it definitely is. And that's why I was saying the pure virtue framework, he thinks, comes with the maximal benefit, but also with the greatest risks. It's definitely optimistic. If you, I mean, imagine a relationship. I was talking to somebody at my school about this who was saying, like, how do you have a proper, leader, administrative sort of like, non-administrative relationship, right? And I was saying, well, probably by Confucian principles, right? The only way the relationship will work is if both sides trust one another. How do both sides trust one another? Well, the people on the bottom will be Zhang if they trust that the people in power care about their excellence. Then they will be almost like naturally driven to virtue through loyalty. The more you're virtuous and loyal to those above you, the more the people on the top feel free to weaken themselves by being shu. Because really that's a kind of like you're putting yourself at risk by doing that. Do you see that? A boss who is shu is not being authoritarian in a sense, and is almost opening themselves up for attack if the people on the bottom want to take over. Do you see what I mean?
You have to be authoritative. This is
Yeah.
the principle
Yeah.
upon which democracy should work.
Mm-hmm.
If democracy works properly,
Yeah.
then you have this kind of relationship between those who are in power
Right.
and those who are not.
Yeah.
You've got an authoritative relationship. There shouldn't be a law to make that right.
Yeah, I think that's right.
If
Yeah, I
it's
think that's right.
functioning properly, then the people are working to give their ideas to
Mhm.
the people above, and they're also working to make things right for the people below.
That's right. That's right.
Constant
Yeah, I think that's right.
flow.
There's a very interesting conversation going on right now between the desire on some people in China actually to infuse the Chinese system with Confucianism again, because it's been out of, Mao kind of tried to kill it, for a long time. So could you have a Chinese democracy? And this is the subject of many, many books. The Chinese democracy being informed by a Confucian tradition like this, as opposed to, let's say, the Jeffersonian tradition that we have, a little different kind of understanding, but still a democracy nonetheless. That would be based on that way of thinking.
Chris?
Yeah.
could I ask,
Yeah, go ahead, Roger.
If I remember the historical Confucius
Yeah.
correctly,
Yeah.
he was a government official, that's where he made a living, but he got fired unjustly.
Yeah,
He
he,
made no appeal to justice even in the
Yeah.
presence of his personal abuse?
yeah, no, he didn't. And he had a government position early. He got fired, right? And then the rest of his life, he strove to get back in. And the reason being, he felt, well, look, in the greatest position of power, you have the greatest possibility for maximum influence over other people. But he never raises issues of justice with them. There's a great story in the Confucian tradition about this son. I mean, it's a terrible story, but you get the point. This son was being beaten by his father, right? And the question was, should the son try to run away and avoid the abuse of the father? And the Confucian answer was yes, but not for the reasons you would think. The reasons you would think would be, that's not just. You can't have a father beating his son. That's not right. But that's a rather kind of justice-oriented way of understanding the situation. Confucius's response is, he must flee for the sake of his father. What? Right, his father is destroying himself through his behavior. You see that? He's still thinking relationally. He's still saying, how do I be Zhang here, right? My way of being Zhang is to flee. You see that? It's a very different way of accessing the question. It's not about me and my mistreatment. I mean, it is indirectly, but it's not about things I own. When you think about justice, you usually think about rights I possess against other people. That's not the way he's thinking. He's rather thinking, my father's really doing himself serious harm here. I got to get out of here before it's irreversible or something. Yeah.
This is me, where you're doing good for one, or you're doing good for both.
Yeah. In the situation of the abuse, yeah.
Yeah.
It also will help him, right? I mean, right. But it's not a question of. I mean, I think if you wanted to, and this is a very interesting question, if you wanted to reintegrate questions of justice into a Confucian tradition, it would have to be the right of the relationship. Does that make sense? It wouldn't be the rights of the individual members. That becomes individual, and then you're back in the Western tradition again. It would have to be that the relationship has a right to something, and both are, have to sort of be committed to that. But that would be that's an interesting project. But it would have to be something like that, and that kind of answer. I have to for the sake of both of us. You know what I mean? That could be kind of cashed out, I think, in a relational justice sort of way. So, yeah.
What if in that illustration,
Yeah.
The son had other siblings who he would beat?
Yeah.
If he just ran away, it really wouldn't help.
If he runs away himself. Oh, I mean for the other brothers and sisters, yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, but see how situational it becomes. It's not still a question of their abuse. It would be, I think, in that situation, a question of how do we save him from himself? What the answer is, I mean, who knows? But that's how you would have to access the question. I mean, it was a modern issue. This came up a couple of years ago. It's actually happened in China. A daughter who was considered herself very Confucian, her father was cheating on her mother. And she tried, and this was very Confucian, to kind of like, raise little objections here and there, right? Dad, I could have sworn, your cell phone over there, you had a weird number on it. That is very Confucian, right? And then you kind of like drop hints, sort of thing, right? And the father was like, yeah, whatever, just sort of ignored it. And she kept trying to do this, and there was no way around it. And finally what she did was she took out a full-page ad in the paper and pronounced her father's infidelity. Now, what in the world? But it was almost like last chance gas, right? Got to save this family. But still, it was about the family. It wasn't about, she was upset, but it was rather about, I can't get this to work in any other way, right? But, it wasn't a sort of like an opting out of the family. It was, now we're really at kind of the extreme situation here. What do I do, right? How do I be an excellent daughter to my father? Who wants to be excellent, but he's not having a good time of it, right now. He's messing up, right? Yeah, Terry.
How difficult, there's so many people that are loners and kind of antisocial.
Mm-hmm.
Where do they get to where they can develop a relationship for both? It looks like in order to be one, you need two.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah. Loners will not do well in the Confucian world. There's different senses of loner, right? There's the sense of I'm going to go live in the woods like a Taoist or something, right? And sort of like become a hermit. For Confucius, that is essentially consigning yourself to animalhood. There's just no possibility of humanity out in the desert by yourself. There's loner in the sense of I'm shy, right? But then there's loner in the sense of literally I have no relationships with other people. Does that make sense? I think Confucius really thinks, think of rituals in a sense. One of the things that really intrigues me about rituals in Confucius, first, the graph for ritual also means gift. Why is that? If I act in a certain way towards my students properly, it's almost as if what I'm doing is handing them a gift, right? I'm saying, here you go. And then I'm waiting to see how you respond to that ritualistic gift or gesture, right? I'm acting virtuously and making possible something for you through that language, which is your virtuous response. Do you see that? I can hand it to you and you can abuse it. That's always possible. But that's why virtue comes with risk, right? But if I don't have those sorts of situations, you see, there's nobody acting that way to me. So I have no response to give. So I become more and more a creature of my own desires, I think Confucius says. I become more of an animal. Yeah.
There seems to be a lot of dialectic meaning.
between,
You know, the world of Confucian,
yeah.
and, not as, and a state of flux all the time,
Mhm.
which is pretty much really well.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. Yeah, I think there's and I always think of this as I mean, this is my more progressive reading of Confucius as well, I'll be honest, but I mean, I think there are some people who read Confucius very, very much as a straight-out authoritarian. Always just jong, 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 right? Make no changes ever. My reading is much more that there is a slow conversation that is always in flux. It is definitely more informed by the past, though, so it's going to be a more conservative tradition without a doubt. But it issues into these, well, look, we're in different times, right? There are different ways to understand things, and you're always trying to integrate those things and see if they're compatible with virtue, right? So, like, I think of things like, you know, common issues today, like, you know, gay marriage or things like that. How would Confucius respond to that? I don't know, but I know how the question would be sort of accessed. It would be, can you have virtue, right? Can you maintain the structures that make virtue possible in those frameworks? If the answer is yes, well then, man broadens the Tao does not broaden man, right? That would be Shu. If the answer is no, well then you would react differently. So but I think that's the flux of the tradition as it moves along. There's probably common structures that would run through it, but a lot of room for this, because times change.